He created a miracle in war on the day when everyone around had already stopped believing even in tomorrow morning. And that was exactly why no one understood at once what had happened. Because in war, a miracle is considered an explosion that did not hit you, or a bullet that passed by. But this time, the miracle was quiet, stubborn, and mortally dangerous to the very logic of a war. "You've lost your mind," the commander told him, looking at his hands, black with dirt and blood, yet strangely calm. "If this works, our own people will destroy us, because war is not about salvation, it's about results, and right now you're stepping into a place where results are not counted." He stayed silent for a long time, not because he was afraid to answer, but because every word sounded like a betrayal of common sense. And only when shells flew over the trenches again did he speak quietly, yet so that his voice cut through the noise of explosions. "If we do everything the right way, one more time, there will be no one left who can say this was a victory, and if a miracle in war is a crime, then I am ready to be guilty." His idea looked absurd, almost insulting to people who had lived for months between death and orders, because he was not proposing a new weapon, not talking about an offensive, not promising a quick end. He was talking about saving those whom the war had already written off. "You don't understand," they shouted at him, and there was more fear than anger in those shouts. "Here you either shoot or you die. There is no third option, and your miracle will only give the enemy time to kill us." He looked at them and saw in each not a soldier, but a person tired of being a number, and that was exactly what gave him the strength to answer without pathos, without hope, only with bitter clarity. "The enemy does not need time," he said. "They need our certainty that there is no other way. And if today we prove that we can stop even for a moment, the war will lose the most important thing it has, the right to decide for us." He began to act even before permission, because he knew permission would never come in time, and every step he took looked like sabotage, every movement like betrayal. But amid this chaos, something strange began to happen, because where there should have been screams and death, silence appeared, tense, fragile, the kind people were afraid to break. "What have you done?" the commander whispered when he realized the shooting had stopped. "You have no idea what you've taken upon yourself." He looked at the front line, where people on both sides had frozen, not because they were ordered to, but because for the first time in a long while they did not know what to do next, and he answered as if he were speaking not to one officer, but to the war itself. "I took responsibility for the pause," he said, "because sometimes a miracle is not victory and not rescue, but a few minutes of silence in which people remember that they are still alive." And he did not yet know that this silence would become the most dangerous weapon of all that had appeared in this war, because where people stop shooting, they begin to think, and war never forgives those who learn to think inside it. The silence he created was not calm. It was tension hanging between the trenches like a taut wire, and every second of this pause felt longer than the previous month of fighting, because when gunfire stops without an order, war begins to look for someone to blame. "You understand that they will bring in artillery now," the commander said hoarsely, gripping the radio as if he could strangle the signal itself. "Because to them, this silence looks like weakness, like a mistake, like an invitation to end everything with one strike." He looked ahead, to where people had fallen just yesterday, and did not answer at once, because the words had to be precise. Otherwise, they would turn into yet another order, and there had already been too many orders here. "They are afraid too," he said at last, and there was no naivety in his voice, only cold calculation, because silence without explanation is more frightening than an advance. And right now, on the other side, there are the same kind of people who do not know whether this is a trap or a chance, and it is that doubt that keeps their fingers away from the trigger. The soldiers around him began to move nervously. Someone crossed himself, someone whispered curses, someone stared at the ground as if afraid to meet their own thoughts, and in this chaotic reaction, he saw how fragile the miracle he had created really was, because a single shot would be enough for everything to vanish. "If anyone fires," the commander whispered, almost pleading, We will not just be destroyed, we will be called traitors, and your miracle will become the reason for even more blood." He turned to the people and spoke loudly, sharply, so that the words would cut through fear without turning into a shout, because a shout always demands an answer. "No one fires," he said, and there was not authority in these words, but responsibility. "If anyone dies today because of this silence, it will be me. And you must know that I am not hiding behind your backs." Someone wanted to object. Someone gripped their weapon even tighter, but no one took a step forward, and it was in this stillness that he felt the miracle begin to live its own life, because people were not obeying an order. They were waiting, and waiting became a new form of resistance. Suddenly a voice came from the other side, not through a loudspeaker and not as a command, but human, broken, full of distrust, cutting through the silence worse than an explosion. "If this is a trap," someone shouted in the distance, "then say it now, because we will not die in silence." The commander shot him a sharp look, his eyes filling with fear, because contact without protocol meant chaos, but he did not retreat and stepped forward. Not hiding, not raising a weapon, as if deliberately making himself a target. "This is not a trap," he answered loudly, and there were no guarantees in these words. It is a pause, and it exists only as long as we all decide not to shoot. A silence fell that was heavier, deeper still, and within it he felt the war begin to grow angry, because it had been deprived of its familiar rhythm. And it was then that he understood that the second act of this miracle was not about salvation, but about a test, because now each side had to decide what frightened it more, the enemy in front or its own thoughts in the silence. The silence began to break people faster than shelling ever did, because when there are no explosions, there is time to think, and thoughts in war are more dangerous than shrapnel. He saw it in the eyes of the soldiers who just yesterday had mechanically followed orders, and now suddenly began to ask themselves what exactly they were holding their weapons for. "You can't hold this forever," the commander said with tense anger that was no longer hidden. "A pause without an order from above turns into a mutiny, and if someone decides you broke the system, they will erase you first, even if no one fires a shot here." He looked at him for a long time, silently, as if weighing not an answer but the price, and when he spoke, there was no rebellion in his voice, only the cold honesty of a man who had already stopped believing in safe decisions. "The system broke long before me," he said slowly. "I only removed the noise so it could be heard, and if someone has to pay for that, it's better me than those who will be sent to die again tomorrow and told it is necessary." Movement appeared again on the other side, not an advance and not a retreat, but something uncertain, nervous. And suddenly 2 people emerged from the fog, without weapons, hands raised. That gesture struck harder than any barrage because it did not mean a ceasefire, it meant trust, the rarest currency of war. "Don't shoot," someone whispered behind him, and there was more fear in that whisper than in all the previous battles. "If someone pulls the trigger now, we won't kill an enemy, we'll kill a chance." He stepped forward himself, slowly, without cover, feeling how each step could be the last, and addressed those standing opposite loudly, but without challenge, because challenge destroys dialogue before it begins. "I didn't come to negotiate victory," he said. "I came to see whether there is still enough humanity left in us not to kill when we don't have to." One of those who had stepped out answered after a long pause, and there was a fatigue in his voice that belonged to no side. "If you deceive us," he said dully, "everyone will die here, and then this silence will become the most expensive mistake of our lives." He nodded, accepting it not as a threat, but as a condition, because any miracle in war stands on a fragile balance of fear and trust. "If I deceive you," he replied, "then I deserve it. But if right now we turn our backs on our weapons even for a few minutes, then maybe, for the first time in a long while, the war will lose not a battle, but its control over us." The soldiers on both sides froze, and in that moment he felt the miracle beginning to crack, because now everything depended not on one decision, but on dozens, on every finger on a trigger, on every heart that might not withstand the pressure of silence. And right then the shadow of a great order hung over them again, because from the rear came harsh signals, ultimatums, demands to resume fire, and he understood that the real enemy now was not in front of them, but behind them, where the miracle was seen as a threat, and the pause as a crime. "We don't have much time," the commander whispered, looking at him as if for the last time. "Either you step back now, or this miracle will end in a tribunal, no matter how this ends here." He slowly exhaled and felt the weight of the decision become unbearable, because the third act of this miracle demanded not courage, but sacrifice. And now the question was not whether the silence would survive, but who would pay for it with their life, their freedom, or their name. The order came abruptly, coldly, without explanations, and in that soulless precision, he heard the true voice of war. Because war never shouts, it simply demands a return to the familiar rhythm of blood. And in that moment he understood that the miracle he had created now threatened not the enemy, but the system that lives only when someone dies. "You must immediately resume fire," the commander said, reading from the screen, his voice trembling not from fear, but from an inner fracture. "The order is direct, without alternatives, without responsibility on the ground, and if you do not comply, you will be declared a threat to the operation." He looked at the line between the trenches, where people were still standing without weapons at the ready, and did not answer at once, because every word now was a choice between two crimes, one of which the world had long learned to call normal. "If I give this order," he said at last, slowly, heavily, "we will return to killing as if this silence had never existed, and then not only the people opposite will die, but the meaning of what we have just proven will die as well. And if I do not give it, you will make an example of me, so that no one else ever dares to stop the war even for a minute." The commander raised his eyes to him, and in them was something like an apology that could not be spoken aloud. "I do not want to be the one who turns you in," he said dully, "but if you do not step back now, we will all be recorded as accomplices, and then this silence will become the justification for an even more brutal offensive." He stepped forward, straight into the open space between the sides, and that movement was not a gesture of defiance, but a sentence upon himself, because now everyone could see that the decision had been made, and that there would be no retreat. "Listen, all of you," he said loudly, addressing both his own and those standing opposite, and in his voice there was neither an order nor a plea, only responsibility. "This pause will end, because war does not tolerate silence, but the question is not whether fire will begin again, but who will take responsibility for the fact that it will." Cries came from the other side. Someone begged not to shoot. Someone shouted about a trap. Someone simply stood silent, and that mixture of emotions tore the air more violently than explosions, because now everyone understood that the decision was no longer somewhere above. It was here, in the few meters of ground between living people. "If you step back now," he continued without turning around, "if you return to your positions without a shot, I will remain here alone, without cover, without a weapon, and I will accept whatever comes after, because someone has to pay for the fact that we have just seen the possibility of another ending." The commander grabbed his arm sharply, his voice breaking, because fear no longer hid behind rank. "You have no right," he whispered. "You cannot decide for everyone like this." He slowly freed his hand and looked at him as if saying goodbye. "That is exactly how war works," he replied. "It always decides for everyone, but today I decide differently, even if it costs me everything." People on both sides began to withdraw, uncertainly, without hope, but with a fear that had finally taken the form of a choice. And in that moment he felt the miracle beginning to fade, but not disappear, because it had already left a mark. And now the only question was whether he himself would survive what he had created. And when he was left alone on that strip of silence, he understood that the finale was near. Because war never forgives those who show that it can be stopped, even for a few minutes, and that the final act would not be about gunfire, but about the price that would have to be paid for a miracle. He stood alone between two sides, and the silence around him was no longer a miracle. It had become a sentence, because when a war stops not by order but by human will, it always demands payment, and the price is almost never limited to one person. "Step back immediately," a voice came over the radio, cold, official, stripped of any doubt. "You are violating a direct order, and your presence in the open area will be regarded as a hostile act with all ensuing consequences." He did not answer at once, because he knew that any explanations now would sound like excuses, and excuses are the language of those who have already surrendered. And only after a long pause did he speak evenly, as if addressing not the command, but the war itself. "I have already done everything I could," he said loudly so both sides could hear. "Now the question is not whether I will survive, but whether you will allow this silence to become proof that a human being is stronger than an order, even if that proof is erased along with me." The soldiers looked at him from different sides, and in their eyes there was no heroism, only fear and shame, because each of them understood that if a shot were fired now, it would strike not only a body, but the memory of this moment, which could no longer be erased. "You are forcing us to become witnesses," the commander whispered, and in his voice appeared the anger of a man who understands there is no way back. "If you are killed here, this war will never again be clean, even for those who believe in it." He turned his head and answered quietly, almost calmly, as if this conversation were the last one worth having without shouting. "It was never clean," he said. "We simply got used to not looking, and if my death forces even someone to look for longer than 1 second, then that will be the only justification I am not ashamed to accept." There was no shot, and that itself became the final blow to the war at this point in space, because when weapons do not fire where they are expected to, the system cracks, and that crack slowly but inevitably spreads. "Withdrawal confirmed," finally came over the air, dry, almost spiteful. "Positions are changing, contact terminated." People began to disperse, not looking at one another, not celebrating and not thanking, because they understood that they had become part of something that does not fit into reports. And he stood until the very end, until the field between the trenches became empty again. When he finally returned, no applause or gratitude awaited him, only silence, heavy and uncomfortable, because a miracle in war always frightens more than defeat, and the commander said it directly, without embellishment. "You will pay for this," he said, looking straight into his eyes. "Not today and not here, but you will pay, because you showed that war is not all-powerful, and it does not forgive that." He nodded, accepting it as a fact, not as a threat, because he understood that a miracle does not cancel consequences. It only shifts the direction of history by a few degrees, and that is sometimes enough to save hundreds of lives that no one will ever count. And when night covered the positions again, he sat in silence, listening to the distant sounds of another front, and knew that his name might be erased, his action might be twisted, but the silence created against the will of war could no longer be taken back, because it remained in the memory of those who saw that even in the middle of hell, a human being is capable of creating a miracle, not for victory, but so that someone else might have a chance to live on.